Good call. Someone has recognized what the image up there is. The Wicker Man, anyone? Anyone into The Wicker Man? It was remade in the 2000s with Nicolas Cage, but there's this old kind of goofy British horror movie from the 1970s where, you know, it's a bit of a spoiler alert, but I don't know if you can actually spoil a film that's 40-something years old. So, kind of anachronistic spoiler alert. The main guy ends up being a human sacrifice as part of this like weird old-fashioned pagan death cult on a British island. Now, why should we talk about human sacrifice? Well, I feel like human sacrifice is the kind of practice where we have really, really consistent, convergent ethical judgments. Today's lecture is about ethical judgment and the nature of ethical judgment. I'm going to situate what we're talking about today in the context of the other things we've been discussing in the first couple of weeks of the semester right at the end. So I'm sort of just going to dive into talking about ethical judgment and its nature. So we could walk around the campus right now and ask every single person we see, what do you think about human sacrifice? And they'll all say exactly the same thing. They'll say it's obviously wrong. Moreover, it's not just like somewhat wrong, it's very, very wrong. It's a completely unjustifiable thing. When we get that kind of consistency and convergence and strength of judgment about a moral question, it's easy, it's perhaps even a little bit tempting to think that we have hit upon a fact. We haven't just got shared opinions or an intersubjective consensus, we've hit upon a fact. We're less tempted to think that way when we have really controversial ethical questions. So remember, in week one of these readings was this article by Peter Singer, where Singer tells us that we should give away most of our money to help underprivileged people. Some people agree with Singer about that. A very small minority of people live their lives in accordance with that kind of ideal, but most of us don't live in accordance with it, and a lot of people disagree with it. So when we're thinking about the question of, ought one to give one's money away to charity or 80% of one's income or something like that, we don't find ourselves naturally thinking there's an ethical fact there that we just have to converge on, because we can see how controversial it is. But with some of our ethical judgments, like the judgment that human sacrifice is really seriously morally wrong, it feels like there's a fact there. What would it mean for there to be a fact there? What would ground that fact? The view that we're going to be zeroing in on today for most of the lecture is a view called non-cognitivism. Non-cognitivism is the name of the family of views that deny that there is any such thing as an ethical fact. Right? It's not that when someone says, hey, human sacrifice, they're like, yeah, we're down with that. When someone says human sacrifice is wrong, non-cognitivists don't come in and say, no, that's a mistake, human sacrifice is fine. They say, just to be clear, your judgment that human sacrifice is wrong doesn't express a truth about the world. It's not something that's in the business of being true or false. Right, so what we're going to do through the course of this lecture is see why non-cognitivists have been attracted to that view, but also some of the problems that arise for that view. So I'll start out by giving you a bit more of a sense of precisely what non-cognitivists say and why non-cognitivism represents a threat to ethical realism. Then we'll look at a couple of different varieties of non-cognitivism and why they are appealing. Then we'll look at this problem, which is usually called the Frege-Geach problem. And this problem has sort of transformed the field of metaethics. 50 years ago, lots and lots of people were non-cognitivists. Nowadays, not many people are, and the Frege-Geach problem is the problem that's persuaded a lot of people to switch teams. And then right at the end, we'll talk a little bit about relativism. This is a kind of challenge to ethical realism that you'll be much more familiar with, because it's part of our everyday moral discourse. We talk about relativism in politics, we talk about it with our friends, people who follow different religious practices. I'm just going to, at the end of the lecture, do a little bit to situate non-cognitivism alongside relativism and show how these different views sort of offer different things to the critic of ethical realism. Okay, but let's talk about human sacrifice for a little bit longer. I want to show you a few different kinds of sentences. The first set of sentences is sentences that we can judge to be true or false. Another way to say that is to say that they're truth-apt. By just a quick show of hands, who's encountered this expression truth-apt before? A handful. It's not a word that's out there in popular discourse very much. It's nothing too complicated. To say that a sentence is truth-apt is just to say that it's the kind of sentence that can be judged as true or false. So, for instance, here's a truth-apt sentence. There are more than 100 Red Rooster stores in Melbourne. Does anyone work for Red Rooster? Or have any other way of... Yeah, was that a hand? So is this true or false? Okay, so I think we're going to defer to your authority because no one else here, unless you're a real Red Rooster enthusiast, probably knows the exact number of stores. I was assuming that none of us would have anything other than a guess to make about this. But let's, given that one person has some degree of confidence, let's pick another chain. There are a few, are there more than 200 Subway outlets in Australia? Well, probably none of us know the answer to that question. But equally, all of us think that there is an answer to that question. We just go out and we count them, or we go online and we add them up, or we call head office and ask. So to say that a sentence is truth-apt is not to say that we know whether it's true or false. It's to say that we could find out whether it's true or false. Here's another example. Bob's mobile phone weighs more than the Eiffel Tower. So that's obviously false, but the sentence, Bob's mobile phone weighs more than the Eiffel Tower, is truth-apt because it's the kind of sentence that can be assessed as either true or false. Right? One more example. Individual human consciousness can survive death. So this is a different kind of case because unlike the Red Rooster case, it's not just that we're unsure about whether this is true. Maybe it's really hard to think of what we would need to do in order to determine whether this is true. It's the kind of sentence that requires a fair bit of interpretation, and even once we've interpreted it, figuring out what kind of evidence can substantiate it or disprove it is a further issue. Nevertheless, it appears to be a sentence that's positing a claim about how things are in the world. It's staking a factual claim, and therefore, in principle, it could be assessed as true or false. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, all right, Bob, this seems to be labouring a point that, what's the significance of this? Right? Isn't this just true of all sentences? Well, actually, it's not. And if you haven't already thought of the kind of examples that show this, let me just give some to you. So, someone says, help, get me out of here quickly. My car is on fire. It doesn't make sense to say, well, except for that last bit, my car is on fire. Just when they say, get me out of here quickly, it doesn't make sense to say that that utterance is a true utterance or a false utterance because it's not staking some claim about how things stand in the world. There's no part of the world that we could go and look at and see, because things are like this, it's true that get me out of here quickly, right? It just doesn't make sense. That sort of utterance is not truth-apt. Here's another kind. How could you do this to me? How dare you? I could have picked, any old question, but I like these more sort of dramatic ones, right? If someone says, how could you do this to me? You can't say, I'm sorry, that's false. Because questions, aren't the kinds of things that can be true or false. The answers maybe can be true or false, but not the questions. Here's one other example. Like in The Simpsons or something, USA, USA, or just any kind of bare expression of sentiment. Hooray, or yeah, sorry.
Is there a reason you're not using declarative as a term?
Not particularly. So you might think that what's generally true of the truth-apt statements, but not the non-truth-apt ones, is that the truth-apt statements are declarative sentences. Yep, that's perfectly fair. But notice that there's lots of different kinds of statements that aren't truth-apt. The first one is something like an instruction or an imperative. Get me out of here. The second one is a question, sometimes called an interrogative by linguists. And the third one is just a kind of a bare expression of sentiment. Now, let's think about the judgment. Human sacrifice is really severely morally wrong. Is that judgment, or the sentence that we use to express that judgment, more like the examples at the top, statements that are able to be assessed as true or false, or is it more like one of these sentences down the bottom, which can't be assessed as true or false? Any initial thoughts? Yeah.
From the perspective of the person who's saying it,
Most of the time, I think that's right. So if you said to me, like suppose I'm one of the very, very small minority of people who thinks that human sacrifice is acceptable, and you say to me, Bob, seriously, human sacrifice is really, really wrong. It seems entirely appropriate for someone to then say, is what he's saying true? Right? And you might say, yes, this is true. I'm telling you something that is true. Right? So at least the speaker's perspective on the utterance gives us some kind of reason to think that the sentence is more like the ones up the top. Okay. Can anyone think of any reasons to think that it's a bit like the one that says, help, get me out of here? Yeah. Yeah, so saying boo human sacrifice in some ways is actually a bit more like saying USA, USA. It's kind of just like, here's this thing and I'm for it or I'm against it. Was that a hand up the back? Yeah. Right, so yeah, if you were to say, like, those exact words, don't commit any acts of human sacrifice, that's kind of, in terms of the style of utterance that is, it's quite similar to help, get me out of here. It's an instruction, right? You might think that when people say human sacrifice is severely morally wrong, that they're just, what they're trying to say, what they're really expressing is like an instruction or an imperative. Nobody anywhere ever should engage in that practice, right? These are the kinds of perspectives that non-cognitivists take. They want to situate ethical judgments and the sentences that we use to express ethical judgments down here in the realm of the non-truth act utterances, right? So another way to kind of flesh out this thought is to think about the way that our mental states relate to the world. So when I form the belief that there are two swivel desks here, right, my belief is trying to map itself onto the world. I observe something in the world, and then I have a mental state, which is kind of like a representation of this little part of the world. And if that mental state accurately represents that part of the world, and then I express it as a sentence, there are two swivel desks there, it gets a tick. It's a true belief, right? But other mental states like desires or preferences or intentions aren't trying to map themselves onto the world. In fact, desires kind of work the opposite way. It's not like you see the way the world is and you try to form a mental state that represents it. Rather, a desire imagines transforming the world. I want to drive a Corvette, so I kind of imagine myself driving a Corvette, and then I try to make the world different so that that desire is satisfied. Okay, so this is just another way of getting at the idea of truth aptness. Mental states that try to represent the world, when those mental states are expressed as sentences, those sentences tend to be truth apt. They tend to be the kind of sentences that we can assess as true or false. By contrast, mental states that just aren't in the business of representing the world, like intentions or desires or preferences, it doesn't make sense to say that you express that as a sentence, that you said something that can be judged either true or false. So just to be clear about that, if someone says, I really, really like the USA, you might be able to say, give a tick of truth to that because they're correctly reporting the content of their attitudes. What you can't say is true is when they just say, USA. Do you get the distinction? It's a true sentence to say, here's how I feel about the USA. I like it. That's true. But just saying, yay, America, that can't be assessed as true or false because it's not making a claim about the world. All right. So cognitivism is the view that most of us who sort of hold in a naive way before the question even arises. We just assume, because of the way that these judgments look, we assume that they at least sometimes express beliefs about how things are in the world. Right? I was saying over here, someone says human sacrifice is really, really morally wrong. Cognitivists say that sentence is trying to represent a fact about the world, something independent of the speaker's perspective on it. Non-cognitivists deny that view. Non-cognitivists say moral judgments are mental states that don't express beliefs about how things are in the world. Instead, they're more like preferences or desires or instructions or exhortations. And different non-cognitivists have different views on this, which we'll have a look at in a second. Okay, so why is non-cognitivism a threat to ethical realism? Let me give you the sort of premise, conclusion version of the argument. The first premise is where all the action is. It's a little bit complicated. If there are objective ethical facts, then it would have to be the case that our ethical judgments sometimes represent beliefs about those facts. Otherwise, the ethical facts would be entirely disconnected from all of our attempts to think about them. So we're making judgments about ethical issues all of the time, right? If that whole practice of arguing and judging and comparing notes and trying to persuade people about what we think is ethically right and wrong bears no connection to any independent sort of arena, any independent part of like the fabric of reality, if it's just something that we do talking amongst ourselves, if it's just a kind of emergent phenomenon of human consciousness, then ethical realism doesn't look very plausible, right? Because all of our ethical thought and talk and argument is completely ungrounded. Nothing underpins it. It's just something that we're doing amongst ourselves. Okay, so that's the first premise. The second premise is just an assertion of non-cognitivism. Non-cognitivists say that ethical judgments don't represent beliefs about ethical facts. They're more like desires or instructions or something like that. So you put those two premises together and you get the conclusion ethical realism is false because there are no objective ethical facts. Those two statements are just supposed to be equivalent to each other. Now, so think about it this way. Why does non-cognitivism pose a threat to ethical realism? Because if you put it together with another very plausible sounding premise, you can infer from those two premises to the conclusion that ethical realism is false. So asking whether we should be non-cognitivists has implications for the larger ethical realist project. If the non-cognitivists are right, if our ethical judgments are not expressing beliefs about how things stand in the world, then ethical realism is in trouble. Okay, so should we be non-cognitivists? Let me show you a couple of different varieties of non-cognitivism, which you'll already be familiar with if you did the readings for this week, that can help us think about why non-cognitivism is an appealing view. So here's A.J. Ayer, famous British philosopher of the mid-20th century. He says, "Someone may disagree with me about stealing in the sense that he may not have the same feelings about stealing as I have, and he may quarrel with me on account of my moral sentiments. But he cannot, strictly speaking, contradict me, for neither of us is asserting a genuine proposition." So think about like if you have an argument with one of your friends about a pop singer or an actor that you like, I really like Beyonce. Oh, Beyonce sucks. No, Beyonce is great, right? There's a sense in which you're quarreling because you do have different feelings about Beyonce, and you might be mildly offended that your friend has different feelings. But what Ayer's saying is that you're not strictly contradicting each other, because I like Beyonce, and then someone else saying, I don't like Beyonce, those sentiments can be true at the same time, right? There's no sort of logical law that says everyone's sentiments have to be identical. So we're not really contradicting each other. What Ayer is saying is that moral judgments are just like that. Yeah, we have different moral judgments. Our sentiments sometimes don't line up perfectly. But when we express those different moral judgments, we're not contradicting each other. So this brand of non-cognitivism is usually called emotivism. Just to be really clear about this, emotivism is not like a rival view. Emotivism is one of the ways of being a non-cognitivist. We're in the non-cognitivist camp, and this is one of the sort of families of views that fit within that camp. It's called emotivism because, on Ayer's view, in every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. So when you say human sacrifice is wrong, you're saying like, boo, human sacrifice. I don't like human sacrifice. In the article, Ayer kind of invents a notation, which is double exclamation point. Human sacrifice, double exclamation point. That's all that you're expressing when you say that it's wrong. You're just saying, down with it. We're against this. Okay. A different brand of non-cognitivism is this one that was espoused by another British philosopher of the 20th century, R.M. Hare. His view was called prescriptivism because he thought that ethical judgments were more like prescriptions or instructions than mere expressions of emotion. So it's more like the case we said before. It's not so much when you say human sacrifice is wrong that you're saying, I don't like it. It's more like you're telling people, hey, no one do it. One of the reasons Hare liked this view and thought it was better than Ayer's emotivism is because it maybe makes it a little bit easier to make sense of what's going on when we have disagreements. Because when we have disagreements about some ethical questions, it doesn't always seem like we're just like comparing our sentiments, comparing our emotional responses. Sometimes it feels like we really are quarrelling about more substantial things. Think about when you're driving down the street and your sat-nav says, turn left at the next intersection, and your partner sitting next to you says, no, 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 don't turn left, just keep going straight ahead, right? Eyre thinks that ethical disagreements are a bit like that. We're competing about trying to tell people what they ought to do. But nevertheless, like Eyre, the fact that these names rhyme is annoying, Hare thinks that there's no fact of the matter that we're disagreeing about, right? We're not contradicting each other with a factual claim. When someone says, hey, turn left, and the other one says, hey, turn right, it's not like one of them is saying something true and the other one's saying something false, right? Because commands and instructions aren't the sorts of things that can be true or false. So both of these guys share this view that ethical judgments are the kinds of things that can't be properly assessed as either true or false. Now, why would you like this view? Actually, I want to go back. So, I mean, two reasons you might like this view. One is you can think of examples where an emotivist characterization of ethical judgment seems really, really plausible. Does anyone have an example that springs to mind? A case where someone makes an ethical judgment, but when you look at it closely, it seems like probably what they're doing is just expressing an emotional response to something. Any examples pop into people's minds? Yeah.
When people say eating dogs in particular is wrong.
Hitting dogs in particular.
I mean, eating dogs.
Oh, eating dogs in particular. Yeah, okay, great example. Yeah, because there it looks like the only way to explain the inconsistency in like it's wrong to eat these things but not to eat these things is that we have a certain kind of emotional attachment to one example. Yeah, great, good example. The example that I really like, that where I think, gee, an emotivist characterization just hits the nail on the head. Think about when like you're talking to family members or loved ones about a big life decision, like moving city or having children or pursuing some career opportunity or going for a long trip, and you're having a fight. You and your partner or your family member disagree about what you're going to do, and at some point the fight takes a turn and someone says, you know, I think you're just being selfish, and tries to moralize the disagreement and pin a sort of a moral defect on your view. In those kinds of cases, you know, superficially it looks like they're making a moral judgment. You're being selfish and selfishness is morally wrong. But actually, beneath the surface, that just seems like a trumped-up way of saying, I really, really don't like what you're doing. I'm opposed to it. No, right? Equally, that's an emotivist approach. I think prescriptivist interpretations of ethical judgments in particular cases look really, really plausible. So when Singer says to us, you have a duty to give away lots and lots of money to the poor, it's kind of plausible to interpret Singer as basically just exhorting us. He's saying you have a duty, but really what he's really saying underneath that is just, come on, give money to the poor. Get out there and do it. I'm exhorting you to do it. Why these views are pretty radical is because they say that all ethical judgments are like that. So I think if we're looking at the entire panoply of ethical judgments, it's really easy to look at them and think some of them, the emotivists are right about those ethical judgments. When people say that, it looks like they're just expressing an emotion. The prescriptivists might be right about others. But these guys are saying there are no ethical judgments that can be understood in any terms other than these kind of reinterpreting ways. Okay. Why should we like these views? Well, one thing is that they're kind of metaphysically easy. So if you have a realist ethical thought, your beliefs are supposed to be representing something out there in the world. And it's really hard to say what's the little region of reality that the beliefs are representing. If you say that human sacrifice is wrong, where's the region of reality? What facts, like observable facts about the world, make it true, make it a fact that human sacrifice is wrong? It's not that there's no answer at all that can be given to those questions. A lot of ethicists have tried to answer those questions. But non-cognitivists have a really easy time here because they say, well, we don't need... Ethical judgments are not in the business of representing the world. They don't have to be true or false. I can tell you a story about where your ethical judgment comes from,
Your ethical judgment just expresses a sentiment that you have. It's all just in there. It's all just your psychology. You have a negative sentiment and you express a judgment about it. So there's less of a kind of metaphysical burden that you take on in defending a non-cognitivist view. And relatedly, there's this kind of epistemological element to it as well. Right? If you have a realist ethical viewpoint, there are these moral facts out in the world, and when you make a moral judgment, you're trying to represent those moral facts correctly. And the question as to how you could ever be justified in thinking that you've latched on to the moral facts is like a complicated one. You have to give some epistemological account of how you get access to that moral fact. Whereas, again, non-cognitivists just have a much easier time here, right? Because the beliefs aren't trying to represent the world as true or false. Your judgment that human sacrifice is wrong is just another way of saying I'm against it or instructing people not to do it. And how do you get access to that underlying source? Well, again, you don't need any fancy story about how you get access. It's all just a function of your own individual psychology. So these are some of the reasons why non-cognitivists have, at a certain point in the mid-20th century, the majority of meta-ethicists were non-cognitivists. These were the winning views around the kind of 1950s and the 1960s. Okay, I'm going to skip over this point about moral motivation just to keep moving on. So what happened? Why did these non-cognitivist views that have some evident attractions, why did they go from being really, really popular to really unpopular? So to get this, we need to get the Frege-Geach problem. This is pretty technical, pretty difficult. I'll try to give a good summary of it, but it won't surprise me if some of you by the end of this lecture are still a little bit confused about what exactly the Frege-Geach problem is. Hopefully by the time you've had some tutorials about it and read the readings carefully and maybe answered a question about it in the expository exercise, you'll have got it in your head. But let me make a first pass at explaining the Frege-Geach problem. So let's just warm up to the Frege-Geach problem with an observation. The sentence "crows are black" and the sentence "stealing is wrong" look superficially really similar. They both identify an entity, crows, the act of stealing. They both identify property, blackness, wrongness, and they attribute the property to the entity. So superficially, they both look like simple formulations that represent a state of affairs in the world, right? Moreover, to bring back to something that came out right at the start, when people say these sort of sentences, typically, if they haven't studied metaethics, they just assume that what they're doing is representing the world in a similar way in both instances, right? People naively take themselves to be expressing facts when they make judgments, irrespective of whether they're about crows or moral facts, right? So, non-cognitivist views, if you like, are a little bit audacious. They come along and they say, yeah, I know that you think about things that way, but guess what? You're completely wrong. You think that you're expressing a straightforward fact about how the world is when you say stealing is wrong, but actually you don't know what you're doing when you have that judgment or when you express that judgment. It's completely different to crows are black. Yeah, I know that doesn't seem that way to you, but it is. If non-cognitivism is true, then at the very least, most people have lots of false beliefs about, sort of meta-level beliefs about the status of their moral judgments. Okay. But the problem goes deeper than that. The Frege-Geach problem is not just a problem about differing appearances. It's not merely that stealing is wrong looks a lot like a truth-apt propositional statement. It's that in our normal, moral discourse, that phrase functions a lot like a truth-apt proposition. So what do I mean by saying that it functions like a truth-apt proposition? Well, think about when we use sentences like this. If stealing is wrong, then software piracy is wrong as well. When we use conditional sentences like this that embed moral terms, it looks like those conditional sentences have something equivalent to the structure of, if all crows are black, then your pet crow Jill is also black. A particular fact about, like a generic fact about the world, entails some more specific fact about the world, right? And moral sentences look like they work the same way. When we have arguments and disagreements with people about this, whether in everyday life or in the philosophy seminar room, this is how we use ethical facts all the time. They function in our reasoning. They function in this reasoning where like little chunks of ethical claims can add up together with other ethical claims in this compositional way, and we can use them in sentences that have sort of complex logical syntax, right? But it's really, really hard to do that if you have a non-cognitivist interpretation of a phrase like stealing is wrong. Because think about if you're an emotivist, for example, if you've got Ayer's version of non-cognitivism, think about how that sentence comes out. Stealing is wrong means, stealing, boo, stealing. And software piracy is wrong means, boo, software piracy. So it comes out as, if boo, stealing, then boo, software piracy as well. Now, you might think that there's a kind of consistency about those two sentiments, but there's no logical entailment between those two sentences. Sentiments don't have logical entailment relationships in the way that propositions do. And just to give you a really kind of obvious example of how this can go a bit funky, think about if someone says like, if boo carrots, ooh, I don't like carrots, then boo carrot cake, I don't like carrot cake, right? If you could get like logical sort of syntactical relationships between sentiments, then that looks like a permissible inference. But we know it's not a permissible inference. Liking carrots and liking carrot cakes are two completely different things. The mere fact that you use the word carrot in expressing your sentiment doesn't have any logical entailments because sentiments aren't those sorts of things, right? Feelings don't obey the laws of logic. If you want to make sense of that sentence in the normal run of things, the easiest way to make sense of that sentence is to just assume that stealing is wrong represents one kind of a fact, and then piracy is wrong represents another fact. And if the sentence is well formed, it's because the first fact entails the second one, right? People who are ethical realists, or I should say people who are cognitivists, have no trouble at all interpreting these kinds of complex moral sentences because they think they behave exactly the same way as all other sentences that have this kind of syntactical structure, right? It's an easy ride if you're a cognitivist. We don't need any special theory to interpret the meaning of moral sentences because it's just exactly the same as the meaning of all other sentences. If you're a non-cognitivist, now you need a whole special theory of how we interpret the meanings of these sentences. So neither Ayer's view, neither an emotivist view, nor Hare's prescriptivist view can easily make sense of how the expressive effect of a particular phrase, like stealing is wrong, functions once the phrase is embedded in a judgment or a sentence with a more complicated logical syntax. You see, I say they can't easily make sense of this. People who like non-cognitivism, since the Frege-Geach problem kind of got a lot of uptake, have been working really, really hard to develop theories of like interpretation that can make sense of moral sentences whilst still, you know, following that emotivist or prescriptivist idea, right? But it's a really, really hard ask. The cognitivists, to say it again, the cognitivists have an easy ride here. They don't need any special theory about the meanings of moral sentences. Okay. A philosopher named Mark Schroeder, I'll put one of his readings up on the suggested readings on Moodle after the lecture, calls this the compositional constraint. Your theory of the meanings of sentences has to be linguistically respectable. And what I mean by that is, people who work in linguistics tell us that it's a really consistent feature of like normal spoken languages that you can interpret the meanings of complex sentences by understanding the meanings of the like smaller component sentences, right? So that's what you've got to try to construct if you're a non-cognitivist. You've got to find a way so that we can still interpret the meanings of complex sentences, or a way to vindicate what we know to be true, which is that people can interpret the meanings of complex sentences by understanding the meanings of the little parts and components that fit into this. But at the same time, you've got to tell us a story on which the little parts and components don't even express facts. They merely are expressions of emotions or prescriptions or things like that. Again, it's not that there's no way to do this, but it's a really tall order. Okay, so because of this, the non-cognitivist choice is either just to say, well, do you know what? When we use moral sentences, we're just systematically confused. All societies think that they're talking about facts, but they're not, and moral discourse is just a complete wash. Or you have to come up with this alternative theory by which we can interpret the meanings of complex moral sentences. Neither option is particularly appealing, and because of that, a fairly strong majority of philosophers nowadays favour cognitivist interpretations of moral judgment. So you might decide for yourself that you want to join in the project of trying to figure out the non-cognitivist theory of meaning. I'll put up an extra reading on Moodle by a guy named Simon Blackburn, whose work has kind of attempted to supply us with a theory of meaning for emotivist interpretations of moral language. And if you like what Blackburn's up to, then maybe you'll kind of find a way to locate yourself in the non-cognitivist region of the map. Okay, so how does this relate to relativism? Non-cognitivism is a threat to ethical realism, but it's not a threat to ethical realism that we talk about very often in everyday discourse. Relativism is one that we all know about, right? Because it comes up in popular political discussion, it comes up in debates with our friends. Anytime we're talking about religious disagreement, we talk about relativism. Let me just give you a sense of how the dialectic leads us to relativism. So, everyone agrees on a particular moral judgment. Everyone says the practice of ritual human sacrifice is a disgusting and grotesque moral stain on the history of human civilization. Non-cognitivists like Eyre come along and say, you know what, this is really just a way of saying, boo, human sacrifice. Or Hare says, this is really just a way of saying, hey, everyone, no one ever do human sacrifice. Geach and other people who run the Frege-Geach problem say, well, that's all well and good, non-cognitivists, but now you've got to explain to us how we can interpret sentences that have this kind of more complex syntactical structure whilst embedding moral sentiments. So maybe a different way to defend anti-realism is to wriggle out of the Frege-Geach problem and say, all right, let's accept that moral sentences do express truths, or do attempt to express truths. They are truth act. Except we'll just say that what makes them true or false isn't something objective. It's just something about the judgments of individuals or communities that make ethical judgments true or false. So if I judge that human sacrifice is wrong, that still can be true, but it's true not because of some esoteric fact in a region of reality that's difficult to observe. It's true just because I live in a society, we all live in a society that agrees that human sacrifice is morally wrong. So there's, I went a bit too quickly there. Why you might want to be a relativist, essentially, emerging out of this dialectic, is that you get the benefits of non-cognitivism, you get to duck these kind of tricky metaphysical and epistemological problems that ethical realists have to deal with, but you don't incur the problems like the Frege-Geach problem where, because you said that ethical judgments don't express truths, now you have to supply an alternative theory of meaning. Relativists are trying to get the best of both worlds. Okay, so a couple of different varieties of relativism. One species is cultural relativism, which says that the facts that ground ethical truth, the facts about what particular cultures think. A different kind of relativism is individual relativism, sometimes called subjectivism. It says the facts that ground ethical truths are facts about individual convictions. If you've read the article by Russ Schaefer-Landau, he gives a nice kind of taxonomy overview of these different ways of being a relativist, right? As you all know, I suspect most of you, having studied intro philosophy last year, probably quite a few of you have studied philosophy at high school or read on your own time. I suspect you're all kind of somewhat aware of the major problems that accrue to relativism, right? And Schaefer-Landau's article kind of stresses these. Just to be clear on why you might want to be a relativist, right? You don't have to deal with the Frege-Geach problem, right? You get to reject ethical realism without getting the Frege-Geach problem, so it's better than non-cognitivism in that respect. And maybe it's also better than non-cognitivism in the sense that it's a little bit easier to understand what's going on in ethical arguments. When you have really heated debates with people about ethical questions, it's not like you're just disagreeing about what we ought to do, or just disagreeing about how you feel, sometimes it really does feel like you're disagreeing about questions of fact. Well, the relativists can at least the cultural relativists can make sense of that, right? Because there is some fact about whether our cultural mores and cultural practices ultimately support or fail to support a particular practice. And in the controversial cases, like think about euthanasia, some parts of our cultural practices tell us that we should let people do euthanasia because we really respect individual autonomy. But other parts of our cultural practices say we shouldn't because we really respect something like the sanctity of life. So when people have debates about that, cultural relativists have a slightly easier time making sense of what's grounding that debate. They're trying to read what our culture says about it, but it's hard to say precisely what we should infer from all the other things. So there are things about relativism that are nice, but as I said before, there are these pretty hefty costs that we incur. One way to put this problem is that really when it comes down to brass tacks, no one seems to be able to bite the bullet and be a consistent relativist. So here's some quotes from the Schaefer-Landau article that really tease this out. He says, for relativists, moral principles can be based on prejudice, ignorance, superficial thinking, or brainwashing, and still be correct. The origins of our basic moral beliefs are irrelevant. He goes on, both forms of relativism, cultural relativism and individual relativism, make the deepest commitments of each person or society morally infallible, no matter whether such commitments reflect ignorance, bias, sloppy thinking, etc. Right? So the dialectic that I'm trying to construct for you is something like this. There are all sorts of problems that you get in being a non-cognitivist, problems to do with understanding the meanings of moral sentences. If you are really skeptical about ethical realism, then relativism on the surface looks like a neat alternative because you get some of the benefits of non-cognitivism without all the costs. But then you just get another set of problems of your own. And part of what I hope that you're picking up about these meta-ethical debates as we go along is something about the structure of these meta-ethical debates. If I could draw up on the board right now, maybe I can. Let's try this. I've never done this before. Do I have Word? Or use Excel? Okay, so we list all of our different meta-ethical views. Last week we talked about, this is really high pressure, like typing for a whole lecture theory at once, psychological egoism. Today we've talked about non-cognitivism, see what I mean? And we've got two varieties of that, emotivism, and then we've got, and I also have to type correctly in real time as well. And then we've got relativism. And then, of course, we've got the rival view to all these, ethical realism. And then over here, we've got pros and cons. And really what we're doing with, like, all of these views is stacking them up against each other. None of these views is going to come out as an obvious winner, right? Each of these views is going to have things about it that make it attractive. Intuitions that it can preserve. It's going to kind of resonate with some element of our way of reflectively understanding our own ethical thought. But at the same time, each of them is going to incur some problems as well. And we're never going to be at a point where we can just say, aha, so prescriptivism gets 3 pros and only 1 con, and therefore we should accept that view, right? It's more like this. We're trying to map a whole lot of costs and benefits. Think about when you're just trying to decide what suburb you're going to rent in, or at a different stage of life, what suburb you're going to buy in, right? No suburb, unless you're like super rich and you can just live wherever you want, no suburb automatically comes out of the winner. Some suburbs have good shops, but there's a lot of traffic. Some suburbs are like really, really nice, but horribly expensive. Some are really, really cheap, but you get stabbed. There's all these different pros and cons. And in the end, which one should you go for? Well, it partly depends on what your priorities are, what really matters to you, right? The analog in this case is not so much what your priorities are, but what do you want out of an ethical theory? Like, what do you think is the most important thing for an ethical theory to do? If you're like really, really scientistic, if you think ultimately ethical theories just have to be respectable when stacked up against our best scientific theories, then ethical realism might get like a really, really big con, right? Partly because giving a naturalistic account of the sources of moral facts is pretty tough, right? An account that like will be consistent with our best theories in the sciences. If you think that we really, really need to be able to capture intuitions about, or like a theory of semantic meaning, then these guys over here are going to get some big cons as well, right? Because if you want to defend non-cognitivist views, you've got to construct a whole theory of meaning that's going to satisfy this really difficult compositional constraint. So this is what metaethics is like. We're not going to crown an obvious winner. We're going to look at the different views, try to map them out, and see the costs and benefits that we get from adhering to them. Okay. How do I get back to PowerPoint? Okay. So we've now looked at 3 different kinds of challenges to ethical realism. Last week we talked about psychological egoism, which is mainly trying to pick up elements of moral psychology, an understanding of what our motivational structure is like, and ask whether a realist ethical theory is compatible with what we know about our psychology, given this bridging principle of ought implies can. Today we've said just a little bit about relativism, where some of the advantages of relativism are fairly familiar to us. Some of the difficulties of it I just talked about briefly, and the Schaefer-Landau article teases that out in much more detail. And non-cognitivism, which is a view I expect few of you will have encountered before, but has been really influential in these debates in kind of academic philosophy over the last century. And this is just to reiterate what I said. What we're aiming to do here is not decide what is the obviously correct metaethical view. If there was an obviously correct metaethical view, we would have just closed the book on this and got straight down to normative ethics. What we're trying to do is show you the options, show you the costs that you incur in taking any one of these views. And let me be clear, there's no view on the table that doesn't incur some tricky costs, right? So when you're writing your essays and your expository exercise later in the semester, the name of the game is not like getting the answer right and saying, oh, Bob told me that I should be a prescriptivist, and now I can be a prescriptivist. What you've got to show is that you understand the ways that different kind of problems arise for each of these views, and that you can make a judgment about which problems you think are the lesser of however many evils. Does this make sense? Good, okay. So we've got one more week that's kind of looking at exclusively metaethical stuff. Next week we're looking at moral motivation. The expository exercise, so next week we've got that, then we've got the mid-semester break, and the expository exercise is due the Monday immediately after the mid-semester break. All right, so as you're finishing your leftover Easter eggs, you'll also be writing about prescriptivism and so on and so forth. Once we've got past the expository exercise, we're going to kind of shift gears and start talking about normative ethics. So looking at competing normative ethical theories like consequentialism, deontology, and contractualism. Is there anything else I want to say? Oh yeah, I looked on Moodle, and I think I had just about the highest ever response rate in terms of number of students enrolled and number of students who actually submitted the first assignment that I've ever had. I think it was like 132 students enrolled and 131 submissions. So thanks for that. Those will be marked by next Wednesday, and then you'll be able to build on the expository exercise from there. All right, thanks a lot. See you next week. Is Max your tutor? Guy with the moustache? Oh, Brendan? Cool. Okay, I'll talk to Brendan. I don't know what's going to be the best thing to do there. Yeah, just haven't thought about it. Okay, let me get back to you. I'll put it on Moodle, on the forum. Yeah. Absolutely. So there are some moral claims which are true in what we might say analytic sense, which is just correctly understanding the meaning of words entails that it can't. So if what we mean when we say murder is killing that is morally wrong, then the sentence murder is wrong is true just by definition of the term murder. Right? So I assume the word does this happen? representation is like the different Klinefelter problem, the Frege-Geach problem. Is that I'm not sure if that's that. Yeah, let's just carry this on outside. The students for this next class come streaming in and then we can't get out. Quick! Oh, sorry, I just got to close this. Don't save. Kill. Don't save.